speaker. The third work of fiction that we discussed was The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and she shared her exhaustive knowledge of both Sherlock Holmes and the fandom culture around it. And then Devin Towery came and talked to us about, she ended up talking to us about constructed languages, and it was a very deep philosophical conversation. And so they've both been really big hits with the teen crowd. So it should tell you something about how entertaining they are. So I'll let Ivona do some more introducing while I get the projector set up. And this is for you. And you should be able to operate it from there.
So Elisha is a very dear friend of mine. We are family. And a couple of years ago, she started saying that there was this Sherlock Holmes Society in Denver that she wanted to check out, but not on her own. So I had to go. And it was a fascinating group of people. I do recommend them. They're called Dr. Watson's Neglected Patients. They meet at least once a month, I want to say, at Pine's Pub in Denver on the Sundays. And we actually hung out with them quite a bit, but Elisha took Sherlock Holmes to heart. So she's already a doctor of psychology and also probably one of the smartest people I know, just regardless of that stuff. But she took Sherlock to heart. She got annotated books of Sherlock Holmes stories, and she read them all, and she compared them between editions and did all kinds of stuff that I certainly did not do. And they have a quiz every time you meet at this Pines Pub. They're, you know, right down to business with that. And she won several trophies there as well. So when we discussed what she could do at the symposium, I just really hoped she would do diagnostics of Sherlock. So I'm introducing Elisha Conant. Thank you.
I have to share one little addition about that story was that Ivona agreed to go to Dr. Watson's with me if I would go to Grey Havens with her. So it worked out for both of us. All right, so diagnosing Sherlock. Okay, so I'm going to start with a brief history of Sherlock Holmes and fandom before going into the diagnostic piece. So the first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, was published in 1887, and this is one of the full novels. And this novel and the next, A Sign of Four, got a pretty average reception. And then in 1891, A Scandal in Bohemia, the first of the short stories, was published in the Strand magazine. And this was an exponential hit. Like, people were so excited about this character, and it really historically hit at a perfect time when there were more people living outside of London and commuting in on the trains. People had more time for leisure reading, and literacy rates were higher. So you had these really nicely sized stories that you could read during your commute, on your lunch break, on your trip home. And so these stories started to sell out. I mean, extremely popular. And really, one of the world's first fandoms was born. And what makes it different than previous characters that were very popular is that the fan mail that was written about Sherlock Holmes was actually written to Sherlock Holmes. People weren't writing to Conan Doyle. They were sending letters to the publisher, to the Strand, to Conan Doyle, addressed to Sherlock, asking for help in finding a lost heirloom or sharing suspicions about a creepy neighbor. We also saw a lot of fan fiction. Now, taking someone else's character and writing stories about them was not a new thing, but people were asking permission from Conan Doyle, and he had a very hands-off take on this. He is quoted as saying, "Murder him or marry him, I care not." So people really felt like they had a license to do whatever they wanted with this character. In 1893, The Adventure of the Final Problem was published, and in this story, Conan Doyle kills Sherlock Holmes. And there was a huge uproar. People treated this death like it was real. People in London wore black armbands. There were obituaries published in major newspapers, and hundreds and hundreds of people canceled their subscriptions to the Strand in protest. Conan Doyle got letters, even from his mother. You can read the letter from his mother asking him to please bring the character back. And it took him 9 years to write another Sherlock Holmes story, and that was The Hound of the Baskerville in 1901, 1902, which they published as a serial in the Strand. And then there were stories on a regular basis until 1924, 3 years before Conan Doyle's death. During this time, scholarship began to appear related to Sherlock Holmes, and that scholarship is called The Game. And again, this is scholarship that is done from the perspective that Sherlock Holmes is a real person, Watson is a real person, and maybe they're still alive, and that Conan Doyle was merely their editor or their literary agent. And we see that Sherlock Holmes is pervasive in popular culture. Sherlock Holmes was not my first fandom, but I was aware of him through things that I liked. Even as a little kid, Encyclopedia Brown novels, modally Sherlock Holmes. Next Generation, I think, was probably my first literal exposure to Sherlock Holmes with Data and Geordie in the holodeck. But you see it in characters like Spock or House. You see characters in Criminal Minds, Doctor Who. These are all influenced by the character of Sherlock Holmes. So as I began to move into my profession as a psychologist, I was naturally interested in the inner workings of Sherlock Holmes. He's a different kind of guy. What made him a different kind of guy? So that's what I'm going to look at now. Not as loud, okay? Okay. So, what are the options I'm going to be looking at today? This is a short list. There are other ideas out there
Jeez,
that I'm
everything,
not
all
going to
four.
explore today, and I'm going to use some broad strokes when describing the disorders. The definitions are from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 4, revised edition. I'll refer to it as the DSM-4. But I'm going to try not to get too psychobabbly. So we're going to start with sociopath. So this was a theory that has been put forth by one of the latest incarnations of Sherlock Holmes, Stephen Moffat's Sherlock, where they say that he is a high-functioning sociopath. So what is a sociopath? A sociopath is characterized by a pervasive pattern of disregard for and the violation of rights of others. So a failure to conform to lawful behaviors, deceitfulness for personal profit or pleasure, impulsivity, irritability and aggressiveness, a reckless disregard for safety, consistent irresponsibility, and a lack of remorse. So what would this look like in Sherlock Holmes? This would look like a man with a poor moral compass, not a great sense of right or wrong. He would struggle to understand human emotions, to have empathy. He would be willing to manipulate others to get what he wanted. He would be superficially charming and not form any real attachments. He would be impulsive, enjoy manipulating others for the sake of it, and be prone to aggression. So there are aspects of this that we could make fit into Sherlock Holmes of the Conan Doyle canon. Failure to conform to lawful behaviors, we see that in stories. We see deceitfulness, we see the disregard for safety. There are pieces there. Watson noted, let me see if I'm coordinated to do all of this. Okay, there we go. Watson noted, so silent and furtive were his movements, like those of a trained bloodhound picking out a scent, that I could not but think what a terrible criminal he would have made had he turned his energy and sagacity against the law instead of exerting them in its defense. So in this we can see that his companions are on some level aware of some of these characteristics about him that would lead to criminal behavior. But I think what they also see is that he has turned those energies towards the defense of the law. In The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, he lets go a criminal, a man that he knows is guilty, and Watson asks him why, and he says, quote, "I am not retained by the police to supply their deficiencies. I suppose that I am commuting a felony, but it is just as possible that I am saving a soul. This fellow will not go wrong again. He is too terribly frightened. Send him to gaol now, and you will make him a gaol bird for life. Besides, it is the season of forgiveness." It was one of these Christmas stories. So this is a person who is failing to conform to lawful behavior, but doing it from a sense of right and wrong. I would also argue that he has a strong understanding of human emotions, that is often the basis of his deductive process, that he's capable of being emotionally distressed, that he has some important attachments, his brother Mycroft, Mrs. Hudson, Watson, of course. So my conclusion is that he is not a sociopath, high-functioning or otherwise. I also would state that a high-functioning sociopath probably wouldn't tell people that. I think that someone who likes kind of maybe messing with other people a little bit would go there. So maybe more of where it's coming from. All right, so the next disorder that we are going to look at is bipolar disorder. So this is characterized by cycles of depressive episodes and manic episodes. So what are those? Well, a depressive episode is characterized by a person having a depressed mood for most of the day, diminished pleasure in activities, eating and sleeping problems, either too much or too little, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, diminished ability to think, and thoughts of death. Mania is characterized by increased grandiosity, decreased need for sleep, being more talkative and having racing thoughts, being distractible, and having, I love how they put this, excessive involvement in pleasurable activities. And these are all things that, by definition, would need to significantly impact daily functioning. Because I think there are parts of that all of us could hear and go, I'm a little that, or I'm a little that. But these really have to impair your ability to function in daily life. So again, I think that we have aspects present in Sherlock's personality. Watson observed, "Nothing could exceed his energy when the working fit was upon him, but now and again a reaction would seize him, and for days on end he would lie upon the sofa in the sitting room, hardly uttering a word or moving a muscle from morning till night." So this really does sound like a description of someone who is experiencing those manic episodes and those depressive episodes. But I would argue that looking at those shifts in mood in the canon is that they don't appear to be connected to an internal neurochemical change, but rather environmental changes. So if Sherlock is having one of these down days and he's on the couch, maybe using cocaine, suddenly Lestrade comes in with this super exciting case and things are really interesting, that's going to activate Sherlock. He's going to want to get up and participate and do that. So if he were truly bipolar, it wouldn't matter what kind of case was walking into the room. You're not just able to shake it off or pull yourself up by your bootstrap. That just doesn't exist within this disorder in that way. So because of that, I think that bipolar is possible, but unlikely. Then we have the last disorder, Asperger's disorder, which is characterized by qualitative impairment in social interactions, impairments in the use of nonverbal behaviors, failure to develop age-appropriate peer relationships, lack of spontaneous sharing, seeking to share enjoyment, interests, or achievements with others, and restricted, repetitive, and stereotyped patterns of behavior. So encompassing preoccupation with one or more interests that is abnormal in focus or intensity, inflexible adherence to specific routines or rituals, repetitive motor mannerisms, or preoccupation with parts of objects. So for Sherlock, I would argue that he has a clear understanding of human behaviors and motives and nonverbal behaviors, and a remarkable capacity to gently soothe and reassure people suffering from extreme distress, talent which really comes in handy for him, dealing both with women and men who come to Baker Street suffering from extreme fear or nervousness. He really has a nice way of getting them to calm down and tell their stories. Again, he has a few people who are close to him. In the adventure of the three Garadebs, Watson is injured. He is shot over the course of the case. And this is his report after recovery. He says, "It was worth a wound. It was worth many wounds to know the depth of loyalty and love which lay behind that cold mask. The clear, hard eyes were dimmed for a moment, and the firm lips were shaking. For the one and only time I caught a glimpse of a great heart as well as of a great brain. All my years of humble but single-minded service culminated in that moment of revelation." Which I think connects to the next point, which is that Sherlock works to actively suppress his emotions to keep himself focused on detective work. He states the emotional qualities are antagonistic to clear reasoning, which also sounds very Spock. So again, my conclusion is that Asperger's is possible, I think actually more possible than bipolar disorder, but not what I would pick. So then what are we left with? We are left with that Sherlock, I don't think, has a diagnosis. So I think that Conan Doyle conceptualized Sherlock as part of an ideal Victorian gentleman. So in the last half of the 19th century, imperialism and this concept of masculine Christianity were a prominent part of British culture. So what that means is that the ideal man was defined as courageous and enduring, like a hunter or an adventurer, which I would argue Sherlock would have been in that category of an adventurer. All of whom were profoundly self-sufficient and independent. They didn't need other people, and all of whom had broad scientific knowledge. Sherlock was a man of science, undistracted by gentler passions, who moved easily through the increasingly disquieted urban space of London, using his wits to solve its moral and practical dilemmas. His actions at that time were not necessarily considered vices, as long as they were done by a gentleman for noble purposes, such as preserving a woman's honor or a family's reputation. He had a strong sense of honor and of doing the right thing. In a lot of the literature that looks more specifically at Conan Doyle, so this is some of the scholarship that's outside of the game, a prominent theory is that Watson and Holmes together were how Conan Doyle saw himself. So Watson was the kind physician, the family man, the person who could relate to the public. And Holmes was the adventurer, both physical and mental adventure, that Conan Doyle really idealized. He had been raised reading these epic historical novels, and he really had a sense that that physical and mental adventure was at the core of what a masculine person should be. In the paper Chivalry, Mutiny, and Sherlock Holmes, 3 Aspects of Imperial Grandiosity and Rage, Diane Simmons argues that Britain, part of why he was popular was that Britain was looking for a modern-day gentleman knight. That Sherlock Holmes emerged in popularity after some small rebellions in the empire had occurred, and people were starting to wonder how long this was really going to last, the prosperity. So she writes, quote, "England needed a new kind of knight, one with wide-ranging interests, whose desire for adventure propelled him into imaginative solutions which could undo threats, and one whose fantastic abilities and unveiling superiority guaranteed eventual triumph over all challenges. An unquestionable superiority that was so attractive precisely because it was an attitude the British feared they were losing." So, in conclusion, when analyzing a character, especially from a psychological point of view, you have to take into account the context in which the character was created. Conan Doyle, I don't believe, would ever have acknowledged this character having a mental health issue, having a disorder. At that time, the predominant disorders of mania or melancholy, those people were ostracized, they were often institutionalized in asylums, and that is not his view of Sherlock, was that this was sort of this idealized gentleman going through London being super effective. And I guess my last thought is about his enduring legacy and why has this character lasted so long. It's been 128 years since the first story was published, and he's still a huge part of our culture. And when I was thinking about this, is it because he's so good at what he does? Like, what is it? And I think it's because he's not perfect. That because he has these parts of himself that are, amazing and fantastic, yet he is relatable because of his imperfections, because he needs Watson, he needs his companion to help him relate to the rest of the world. And I think that's why he continues to be so appealing. Diagnosis or not, I think our society wants that. It wants to have a label for it. But, so that was it. Questions, I guess.
I would like to know why the cocaine use in your professional opinion, and also Elisha, in your fan opinion. So 2 buckets.
Okay, well, so cocaine and morphine, right? He's famous for his 7% solution, which he uses during periods of melancholy when he's bored to help him to feel stimulated. At that time, these were not illegal drugs, and in fact were used for different psychological techniques. But you could see that Watson frowned upon it, and I think that Conan Doyle, in his medical practice and his medical experience, thought that this was not a good thing. So I think that drug use is a reflection of, in that time, there were middle and upper class, predominantly men, using morphine and cocaine on a regular basis. And this was Conan Doyle's way of reflecting on that it wasn't actually, something to be promoted. It wasn't actually helpful. That he wanted, Watson wanted him to stop. And he does stop after the empty house. The drug use stops. So there isn't any explanation for why that happened. Does somebody else want to pick the people who are raising their hands?
John, here then.
Huh?
John.
We know there's a lot of depictions of Sherlock throughout media ever since these stories were published. And I think the character kind of gets changed. Have you seen a version of Sherlock that you would diagnose differently than the character in the stories?
I think some of the more contemporary examples of Sherlock Holmes do lean more towards the Asperger's diagnosis than the Sherlock of the canon. I think that that's something because it's relevant to our society and culture now. They tend to sort of exaggerate. And I think that, I'm gesturing because the picture's right here. I think that Sherlock is, even though he's talking about being a sociopath, is more Asperger's than the Sherlock of the canon.
Kim.
That I was actually going to say something that's exactly the same.
Okay.
Just that, do you think, so when you say context, the fact that his character is so transmutable to our social context and each social context throughout this 128-year history, that authors like Stephen Moffat or whomever wrote Dr. House, were, because mental health issues are a little more acceptable to talk about, we're able to exaggerate some
Yeah.
of these.
And I think that with the drug use too, that it's present in the canon, but there's not a big highlight on it. There's no spotlight saying Sherlock Holmes is a drug addict. But when you get interpretations like House, where actually his opiate addiction is a big part of the character and a part of who he is, because that's something that, again, our culture, in the context of modern life, it's just more important. Do you have a question, Katie? I saw your hand earlier.
Yeah, how would the contemporary Victorians have that description, have Sherlock just lying on a couch for days on end without even moving. How would the contemporary Victorians have taken it? Would they have said that's okay, or he's a little bit off, or?
So it wouldn't have been termed melancholy in the way that we use that word now. I think we use that word for like the blues, a little bit down. For them, I think in the construct of who Sherlock Holmes was in these stories, that it was just viewed that he needed stimulation so much that he craved the input all the time, that when he didn't have a case, this was just sort of the state he was in. So it was a natural state for him to be in when he was not being stimulated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, how would the Victorians have looked at it? Would they have said, well, that's okay, that's just the way it is, or would they have said, gosh, what's wrong with it?
No, I don't. I think Watson kind of holds that the concern for him that some people might have felt in that society. But I think because the way he's constructed is that, you know, he's this adventurer and this pioneer, and he needs to be out there and he needs to be doing things. And so it's okay that he's feeling, you know, a bit down when he's not doing that stuff. I don't think that there would have been any stigma around that.
Last question. This is it, guys. Charlie.
Do you think there's any modern, gentlemanly knights today in American pop culture other than Marvel superheroes?
Theater.
Any modern day gentleman knights? Not Marvel. Okay. Because honestly, I went Daredevil, but then maybe that's, I don't know. Anybody have any thoughts about that? Modern gentleman knight? The Doctor? The Doctor. Which has, I mean, he has so much in common with Sherlock, right? He really needs that companion, just like Sherlock needs Watson in order to be able to translate himself to everyday people. Otherwise, people get freaked out.
We do love our geniuses, though, don't we, Stella?
Yeah.
We're fascinated by them. I know I said that was the last, but do you have any concluding thoughts on our constant fascination with
High
cold,
IQs.
calculating genius who barely shows any emotion at all?
It's funny because it's kind of an aside, I teach a dialectical behavioral therapy class, and we use some of these cultural constructs when we're talking about reason mind and emotional mind. And I think that that's part of it, that we all have this part of ourselves that's like the reasonable mind, that's about the data and the information, and it's kind of cold and calculated. That's a part of all of our makeup, the makeup of a human. And then we have the emotional mind that's very hot and creative and impulsive. And often we see characters like Bones and Booth that are paired together that make sort of a working person.
Mulder and
Because-
Scully, too.
Yeah, Mulder and Scully, because together they're wise mind. So you need Sherlock and you need Watson because you need reasonable mind and you need emotional mind in order to have wise mind. And I think that's part of the appeal, is that in some ways reason mind is idealized in our culture. That when I do this in the class, I think that people are more like, God, I'm more emotional mind, but I wish I was more reason mind. There is an appeal to that.
Okay, last one here. Sorry.
Oh,
I was just going to say, do you think that's why it's so appealing, that photograph Einstein sticking his tongue out?
it's relatable, right? I mean, here's this incredible genius, and he's like, you could be me, I could be you.
Thank you so much.